Good evening, everyone. This is David Mandel at OHEL, and it's really a pleasure to welcome everyone this evening to OHEL's Actor Family National Trauma Center, a conversation, Reimagining Grief, Part 2. Several weeks ago, we began a conversation on reimagining grief, a very compelling evening in which several individuals from organizations who I will introduce in a moment presented very compelling information about their own life experiences. We had many hundreds of people that joined that evening, and many asked us if we can continue the conversation, hence Reimagining Grief Part 2, a special evening, a special event in this month of Elul. This evening is sponsored by Zisa Links, Shlomi's Club, Little Links of Pearls, Samchenu, Meirim, and Our Tapestry, Chanadvora Goldberg. This evening, we will be asking a series, engaging in a conversation with a series of questions that people have sent us in advance and asking our panelists. We also invite you, as the conversation continues, to pose your question on the chat function, that you can either do it publicly and everyone would see it, or you could do it as a private function on your chat. One of my colleagues is monitoring all the questions, and then I will see them and bring them to the group. We will try to combine as many questions as possible into the conversation. At the end of this evening, at the end of the discussion, everyone will receive a request to complete a brief evaluation, which will only take you 2 or 3 minutes, literally, and your feedback helps us plan future conversations. Our panelists this evening are Sarah Rivka Cohn. Sarah Rivka lost her mother at the age of 9. She is the founder and director of Zisa Links and Shlomi's Club, an organization serving children and teens who've lost a parent. They provide this support through publications, retreats, events, and pro bono legal services. Their aim is to give families who've lost a parent a sense that we are in it together. Glenn Holman specializes in grief and serves as consultant to other clinicians and community members. He also speaks frequently on grief in the community. Glenn runs an organization called Meirim in memory of his 2 daughters who passed away. Meirim runs events for entire families who've experienced the loss of a child, with the goal of providing comfort, support, and love, bringing them together with others who can relate to them. Rabbi Josh Grajauer, joining us this evening, is the Menahel of Or HaTorah Yeshiva High School in South Florida. He previously served as the National Director of Education for NCSY, part of the OU. Rabbi Grajauer's first wife passed away at the young age of 33, leaving behind 3 young children. This was a number of years ago. Josh has since remarried a woman who herself lost her husband and has 7 children of her own. Chaya Cohn, a colleague at OHEL, is project director for a comprehensive community-based mental health program. Chaya is an advocate for people who've experienced sibling loss, running bereavement groups for siblings, and leading other sibling support groups at OHEL ZACTA National Trauma Center. Chaya provides this support to siblings based on her own experience losing her brother at a young age. And finally, this evening, Dr. Norman Blumenthal is featured. Dr. Blumenthal is director of OHEL's ZACTA Family National Trauma Center, and Dr. Blumenthal has traveled the country and the world providing support to individuals, families, community in trauma, grief, and bereavement. So let me begin this evening, and again, for those joining us in the last moment or two, we're following this evening a question and answer discussion. Everyone is welcome to submit your questions on the chat function on your screen. And remember that unless you do it privately, everyone else on this call will see your question. You have either option, and I will see all your questions and we'll get to as many as possible. Let me begin by posing a question to Sarah Rivka Cohn, please. So Rivka, how do you know when a child is okay, when a child is not okay? They don't always show it in obvious ways. It may be their age, whether they're very young, or even if they're adolescent, they're quiet, they're non-demonstrative, they're not too verbal. Chaya Cohn, for a child that you're not sure if they're okay or not okay, do you bring it up? Do you engage them? Do you send them for therapy? How do you handle a situation?
I think this is going to be a great way to start the night. Thank you, first of all, again, to OHEL for hosting this incredible evening. I can only say that if you haven't watched part one, I strongly encourage you tonight to watch it. It is available online. I know the link was put into the chat box. Thank you, Glenn. And it was something that I got tremendous feedback on, so thank you. In terms of knowing how a child's okay, I think let's first talk about one thing, and that is that to underscore what David just said is that children often don't look the way we'd expect a grieving child to look. And I think that's a very big piece of the puzzle that people often don't recognize. I know for myself, I once put in a Google search for images of the grieving child, and everything had tear-streaked faces, curled up in balls and stuff like that. And most often in my experience, many grieving children are playing in the schoolyard, are running around with friends, are acting like normal teenagers, and they actually look perfectly fine. And I think that's the first thing to know, is that there is this huge contingency of children who look absolutely fine and are struggling. At the same time, I think it's very important to emphasize is that most grief is normal, which means that there's nothing that we want to necessarily therapize about the grief process, especially not initially. It's when it's complex for different reasons that we want to be able to send the child to therapy. So to answer the last question first, what we always say in our assessments, what we like to look at is, what was the relationship with the deceased parent before? What was the relationship with the surviving parent prior to this loss? What's the current relationship with the surviving parent? What was the nature of the death? And that's a very big one. If a child had good, healthy, wholesome preparation for death, and it was not sudden, and it was not hidden from them, and all this type of stuff, and there was a healthy, wholesome relationship with the deceased parent and the surviving parent, for the most part, this child may be sad, this child may be going through a lot of stuff, but their grief will be normal. What we're looking when children take that usually occur differently, it's often when there was either a complicated relationship with the deceased parent, complicated relationship with the surviving parent, or an illness that was either hidden from them or was sudden because of its nature. Those are usually the contributing factors to where we'll see a child needing a lot more help. I think the beginning question just was, how do we know, right? David, remind me, the beginning part of this question was, I think, something along the lines of, how do we know when a child is doing okay and when they're not? Even when they don't verbalize it and they don't tell it to you, you can see if a child changes dramatically in different ways, whether it's eating, sleeping, behaviors, habits, personality, what they like to do, what they don't like to do. And those are all things that we look at. And obviously, the one thing I will say is that many, many, many children do fine for many, many, many years, and then they experience what's typical of delayed grief. And the one thing that I can say comes along, at least in my experience with a lot of delayed grief, is a lot of shame. And I'll just take another minute to just say a quick story, and then I'll hand the mic over to somebody else. But I remember that when I lost my mother, as I said, when I was 9. And I remember at the age, I did not sit Shiva because my father had given me the option of whether I wanted to or not. I was not able to sit Shiva. And I said, why in the world would I stay home with a bunch of crying adults? I had no interest in it. And so I never did. At the age of 15, I picked up the phone to an anonymous halacha hotline, and I still have a lot of compassion for the person on the other end of the line. And I said, I'm 15 years old. I lost my mother when I was 9, and I'd like to know if I can sit Shiva now, 6 years later. And I think that like I said, I have compassion because I think he didn't know what to do with me. And he obviously had to explain to me that halachically, no, I couldn't just decide right now that I was sitting Shiva. At the same time, he was extremely compassionate and listened, and he did a phenomenal job. I told this story over at a weekend retreat that we had, and there was this line of girls afterwards waiting to talk to me. And they said, this was in our heads, but we thought we'd be institutionalized if we ever said something so ridiculous aloud. So I just want to throw it out there. We're talking about kids and we're talking about when they're okay and when they're not okay. If a child does approach you at some point and in any way expresses an interest to either enter therapy or get help or is showing signs of experiencing grief, and it's years later, the one thing I'm begging you not to say is like, now? Really? This is normal. And this is a big, big piece of what children do, is that they struggle oftentimes way later than people anticipate. David, back to you.
Chaya Rivka Cohen mentioned that most grief is normal. Grieving may depend on the nature of the death of the individual. And Chaya Rivka said that grief and verbalizing may be impacted by the child's relationship with the person who died. Dr. Blumenthal, can you comment, please, on when does a parent know when a child is okay, that being quiet is okay, and to try to distinguish between choosing to be quiet versus possibly experiencing withdrawal or worse, depression? Please comment.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I think Sarifka made my job very easy because she pretty much very comprehensively covered the issue. There's a very big difference between someone who's sad and someone who's depressed. And sadness, as we all know, is normal after death. In terms of the question that a parent might ask is, how am I going to know if my child is experiencing a depression? First of all, I should add that in addition to what Sarif Khan mentioned about the possible reasons for why a child after a death of a parent would need therapy, and she mentioned, of course, what we call ambivalent grief, which is when there was not a great relationship, which true of all grief if there's an ambivalent relationship. The other factors are, by the way, if there's a pre-existing condition or a pre-existing tendency. In other words, a child who may have had an element of anxiety, maybe not a severe anxiety, then a death could amplify that and create an anxiety disorder or depression if there was already a pre-existing tendency towards depression. Also, by the way, I think it's important to mention that trauma can also Sarifka alluded to in terms of the nature of the death. Trauma and grief don't coexist. So If there's a highly traumatic loss, the trauma can sort of eclipse the grief, and then the trauma needs to be addressed, and trauma may need to be treated in order to free up the grief. Another issue that I don't think would be really all that relevant is also what I refer to as retaliatory grief. We see that probably more in situations where there are gang wars and things like that, where the anger about the nature of the death beclouds the grief. But the question in terms of how you're going to know, if anybody knows, a mother knows or a father knows. You know your child, and if your intuition and your gut, your parental instinct tells you that this isn't my child, but sad, this just isn't my child, then it's maybe worth considering. I find also, and again, Sarifka very eloquently referred to this, I find also that if a child needs therapy after grief, it's usually not right afterwards. Usually right afterwards, the child almost wants to prove that they're normal and that they fit in, and they very much resent. I have had situations where parents schlep a kid to my office, and the mother is crying, and because she just lost her husband, and the son is standing there with his arms crossed, and his body language basically says, I'd rather have a root canal without anesthesia than talk to this guy. And usually what I do then is I just talk to the kid. I tell him not to talk to me. But I'll find sometimes a year or two later, when they've really proven that they're okay, when they've proven, paradoxically, when they've proven that they're functioning, and as Sarifka said, they're playing in the playground, then they may want to come and talk. So please don't rush kids into therapy just because they had a loss. One more thing that's important, again, it was alluded to also, children are imprecise in their expressions of feelings. So a child who's angry may cry, a child who's sad may fight, a child who's worried or anxious may complain about stomach aches. So it does require some more discerning to see if a child does need assistance. But again, trust your your maternal and paternal instinct, and you'll know what your child needs.
Dr. Blumenthal mentioned ambivalent grief and how trauma eclipses grief. These are terms that have so much meaning to them. People listening this evening, however you're listening, you may want to write down some of these words, some of these terms. And I appreciated how Sarifka Cohn commented that at the age of 9, she chose not to sit Shiva. Her father gave her the option. There was so much in what she said in those words that her father gave her the option. And at age 9, a 9-year-old understands a lot. And then she decided what she wanted to do at the age of 15. Everyone here who's lost anyone at any age, including when you were an adult, how many people a few years later, even as an adult, you sort of reestablish a relationship with a parent that you've lost, even one that you may have been close with, and a few years later, long after Shiva, you think about things and you reconnect, or you reconnect when you go at the unveiling, or you reconnect 5 years later. So Rivka gave you an example of a 9-year-old to a 15-year-old. So many people can think of their own examples. Glenn Holman. At the last conversation that we had, it was gut-wrenching to listen to you, how you shared about losing 2 daughters. Please tell us, if you would, about guilt. How does a person deal with the concept of guilt? Did I do enough? Could I have done more? What am I guilty of? What do I need to ask Mechila for? Glenn.
Okay. Thank you, David. Yeah, this is something that's extremely common, I would say almost universal. I think it's fair to say, and just to reiterate something that we said in the first panel, how unique each person is and how unique the grief process is. Every person deals with grief differently. They have their own unique way of coping and processing and working through the grief. So one of the challenges for tonight is just to speak in generalizations. So I think I think we're all a little bit challenged with that. So we'll try to speak to things that are, we'll call them common. And the feeling of grief is extremely common. This feeling of guilt resulting from grief is extremely common. And it's something that we deal with all the time. You know, I think that my experience has been, I don't really try to talk people out of it per se, because I think it's something that often may not be even something that an outsider could look at it, right? I've seen the most far-reaching thoughts or feelings like, oh, I wish I had done this, or I should have done that, or why didn't I recognize that? And some of those things are so, you know, there was someone who had a family member who was hit by lightning and unfortunately passed away. And the one of the family members was talking about how they should have watched the weather report and realized that you know, lightning could strike, and to have not allowed their family member to have left the house. And the way that I kind of look at it is like, number one, guilt is often a representation of a sense of recognizing the fragility of the world around us, right? The world is, a lot of it is not under our control. And sometimes guilt can be a representation of our feeling of, our helpless feeling of the world not being in our control. And they could look, guilt can look like, next time if I'm more careful, next time if I have the foresight to do this, then maybe I'll be safe. Maybe my family will be safe. So guilt can be a representation of the feeling of wanting a sense of control. The other part of guilt is sometimes just, it's just a representation of missing the person and love. It's grief at its core, right? If only I had done this, then they would still be with me, right? Which is really, I miss them. I'm struggling, I'm in pain. And I think that what I have a little technique that sometimes I use with people, and it's called using the term "I wish." Well, someone will say, you know, I should have told her not to go out, you know, not to go out in the rain because maybe lightning would strike. I should have, you know, not used that doctor. I should have realized that there's a 1% chance of this and told them not to have the surgery. And what often people say, you know, you shouldn't say that. You know, that's ridiculous. Don't say that. The approach that I take, the technique I use sometimes is something called "I wish." And we say, you might say, I wish I had realized that it was raining, and I wish I had told them not to go out, and I wish this wouldn't have happened. And what's special about, or different about, using the words "I wish" versus "I should have," I wish represents the feeling that I love this person. I didn't want this to happen, and I wish I had within my capability, right? If I had the power to do it, I would have, right? And I wish I had that ability. So it connects you to what you had hoped would be the outcome. It connects you to the love that you have for the person that you love. And at the same time, it doesn't deny you that feeling of wanting a different circumstance, of wishing that things could have been different. So these are kind of the approaches or the perspective that I take, because it is very, very common, and it's, you know, it's one of the real difficulties that happens. Especially there are some circumstances where it tends to be even a greater sense of that feeling of guilt, and there are other types of losses that contain varying types of grief: death by suicide, death by drug overdose. Sometimes, especially parents will express varying degrees of grief and guilt within that grief. So it's just something that I hope that people will be able to work through and to connect with others. Sometimes connecting with others can help, and using the technique of a wish sometimes is enough. And sometimes just you have to accept it. That's what it is. Thank you, David.
Glenn, I liked how throughout your discussion, each time you shared a thought, you explained it in two different ways so that people understand that there isn't always one answer, and the answer may not satisfy you, but you can look at a meaning two different ways. Specifically, you said that guilt may represent the feeling of a loss of control. I am guilty because I couldn't control that person from dying. You similarly explained that guilt could mean I miss them. I feel guilty because I miss them. One is a painful thought and one is a soothing thought. So thank you for offering two different options. One may help one person, one may help another person. Dr. Josh Grashauer, thank you for joining this evening from Florida. I want to ask you one question, and it comes in two parts. The question is, I introduced you before you came on about your situation, losing a wife at a young age with 3 children. And the two of you had 3 children. You lost your wife several years ago, and you've since remarried to a woman who lost a husband who has 7 children. I would like you to please comment about your experience as a young widower with 3 children, what helped and what hurt, although I don't have to ask you what hurt, what helped. And I'd like to overlay that with the fact that you're a public persona. You are head of a large program at NCSY. You're a well-known person. Your name is known. So how did you deal with it personally? And how does a public figure deal with it? Rabbi Grashauer.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, that's a lot of different pieces to those questions. I guess I'll start with being a young widower. I happen not to love the word widower. I don't know, I don't like the word so much, but I found in general, honestly, David, that people were very supportive. I talked about it. I wrote articles about it. I found that by and large, the Jewish community really steps up. And in my personal experience, I very much felt like the community hug that I received from my local community in South Florida, and friends, from all over the place and different people. I think, again, I believe in the first one, I don't remember who, maybe it was Glenn, someone commented, I listened to it, I wasn't able to attend, that everyone's experience is different and every situation is unique, and what's good for one person isn't necessarily work for someone else. I think as time has passed, part of what I've learned is that it's not so much about what people said, it was more about the way in which they approached it. I felt that people who treated me, I would call it normally, treated me like a normal person, even though I know that at that time I wasn't functioning normally, but they were treating me as if I was functioning normally, made me feel much better than people who treated me like a young widower taking care of 3 children. Anyone who treated me, as if, I'll use the phrase like as a nebuch. I don't think they intended to, to treat me that way, but anyone who treated me that way, I felt it was very, again, like subtly hurtful, in that like they weren't treating me normally. Like I just wanted to be treated normally. When I went to the supermarket, I wanted to like say hi and like, let me go buy my milk. When I came to shul on Shabbos morning, I wanted to be able to like sit in my seat and daven, leave when I wanted to leave. I didn't want people to, again, to be treating me in a different way, I guess I would say. At the same time, my like close friends, I definitely wanted them to be there for me emotionally, to like check in on me, I guess my family in a certain sense. And I definitely, again, in my situation with 3 young kids, the practical help was like extremely helpful. People who like, I had neighbors who took on, making dinner for me twice a week. That was like extremely helpful. I had, people who would watch my kids on Sundays for a few hours. That was extremely helpful. For me, again, in my situation, like the practical help, honestly, was like even emotionally, like the most supportive. It gave me like room to breathe a lot of times. It gave me a lot of support in ways that were very, very helpful. I never think of myself as a public figure, to be totally honest. So I don't know how much to answer the second question about being a public figure. I don't know. I kind of just go about my life and do my thing. I don't think of myself in that way, to be totally honest. So it's a hard question for me to answer. I guess what I will say though, which I do get a sense of nechama, like some level of nechama, in like thinking that my experience helps other people. That's what I would say. I wouldn't say that as being a public figure. I would say that as like a person, like when I'm able to speak to people and use my own experience to help other people who have suffered. I wouldn't say it like makes me feel like the suffering is justified, because no suffering feels justified, but it definitely makes me have a sense of nechama, that like a sense of comfort, to translate nechama, a sense of comfort in being able to like use my own experiences to help other people. And I do find that helping other people doesn't just mean helping other people who lost a spouse or who suffered loss, but I definitely think the way I relate to people's struggle and pain has changed completely since since dealing what I dealt with. Like just people's pain in general strikes me differently than it ever did or would have prior. Yeah, I think that's like, I don't know if that answered all your questions, but I think that would, that's what I would say.
You answered them in a very practical way. You spoke about that you appreciated that people treated you normally. You didn't want to be treated as a nebuch. You didn't want to be looked upon as a nebuch. When people treated you normally, you most appreciated it. Close friends should check in emotionally. Sometimes people who have no business asking personal, emotional questions do so, and they really don't have a close relationship with people. And yet they feel that they can be intrusive when it really is inappropriate. You emphasize that you appreciated that close friends checked in with you emotionally. And you spoke about practical help makes a difference. I don't remember at the first session, somebody commented that it's not helpful to say to a person, come over any meal that you want, or any Friday night that you'd like to come over, I'd love to have you. It's much more practical, like you said, how about joining us for a meal this Shabbat? Can I go shopping for you this Sunday? Do you have a wedding next week? I would love to babysit for your 3 children. Offer practical support. People appreciate that. Chaya Cohn. Unfortunately, at the last session, you shared with us how you lost a brother at a young age while he was in the middle of performing a mitzvah. Tell us how you keep memories alive.
So that's a hard one, but that's also comes from keeping memories alive within. I'm going to answer it in 2 parts. How do I keep his memory alive within myself? How do I keep the memory alive with others? And when I say others, I mean my children, I mean my family members, I mean his friends and outside people. So for myself, I'll start with myself. And this is what works for me, because what works for everybody else may not, this may not work for everybody else. This is what works for me, is that my brother had a beautiful smile, and he truly believed in smiling to others. And that it always made their day better. So I try very hard to smile to others when I see that they might be having a bad day, or I'm having a bad day and I just need to smile. And every single time I do a smile, I think about my brother. That's how I keep up his memory within myself. Every single time I do something like give tzedakah, my brother was very big in giving tzedakah. He lived in Israel, and he gave to anybody who would ask. He would give a coin. Whether he had it or not, he would go searching through all of his pockets and try to give him a coin. And that's how I try to keep my brother alive within myself. I ask myself, what would Yonah do? What would Yonah do in this situation? And how can I keep him alive? For my children, as they got older, my children are young, and it's just recently that my oldest is starting to understand death. So for her and for my children, as they get older, I keep his memory alive by lighting the yahrzeit candle, but not just lighting it for myself. I put a picture by it and I explain it to my children. And I explain that, you know, this was your Uncle Yona, and this is what he did. And this is how he was special to the people around him. To the outside world, to the outside community, my brother touched a lot of people. A lot of babies out there are actually named after my brother, not just within my family, but through his friends. We meet once a year, and thank you to Zoom. Once Zoom came about, it became much easier to meet everybody. We meet once a year, and we just talk about him. We talk about Yona. We talk about the things he did, the things he laughed at, you know, the unintelligent things he did when he was in high school. Those things are good to remember too. What I really feel like I'm connecting to my brother, and I feel like I'm letting his memory continue on and his legacy continue on, is when I help others through sibling grief, is when I help others through this forgotten grief, this lonely grief that many people feel like you should just get over it, or you have other people you need to take care of, like your parents and, you know, the widow, I'm not gonna say widower, Josh, but that it's not something that you should continue to grieve about. It's not something you should continue to feel pain about. So this is my way of keeping my brother's memory alive. And the truth of the matter is that your sibling and your loved one will always be remembered. They're always in your mind. Nothing anybody could say can make you remember, can make you forget your loved one. You will always remember your loved one, and you will always have the memories of your loved ones. Keep up those memories, the good ones, the bad ones, that made up your loved one, that made up who they are. And it's important to remember every aspect of your loved one. I hope I answered that question.
You spoke about giving tzedakah. You spoke about remembering Yona's smile. You spoke about lighting a yahrzeit candle, specifically explaining it to your young children who their Uncle Yona was. You spoke about Zooming once a year with Yona's friends, the inside the family and the outside the family memories. I'd like to pose a question to Rivka Cohn and to Glenn. I so vividly remember a number of years ago, I was paying a shiva call to someone, and I'm giving you this first person. The young man was sitting shiva in his parents' apartment, a condo in a very nice building. And the children were sitting shiva, and it was the second parent that passed away. So this gentleman, at the time, I would guess in his 30s, was a yasam. I was sitting, and the person next to me during shiva asked an individual, "So, are you planning on selling the apartment?" So I want to make a huge leap in my question to Sir Rivka and to Glenn. We have all heard stories that someone is sitting shiva. A woman lost a husband lost his wife, and we've heard the stories that at the shiva, someone is saying something, fill in the blank. And one of those things are, can I read you a shidduch? During shiva. Well-meaning people, but, so Rivka, when is an appropriate time? What is an appropriate time? How does it work? A young person, a man or a woman, husband or wife with children, how does one approach and when? So Rivka.
Okay, so I want to first answer in general, going back to what you were saying about sometimes people making just general comments that sometimes like that selling the apartment story. And I want to speak to two pieces. In terms of oftentimes people saying things because they feel uncomfortable. And when they feel uncomfortable, people don't know what to say. And when we feel uncomfortable and don't know what to say, we say the dumbest thing that comes to our heads. And I think all of us have been guilty of this in some form. And if you haven't, I really want to meet you because it's something that's probably not so human. But all of us, I think, have been guilty of this. I know I certainly have. And for a time, I'll say even worse, is that I avoided Shiva houses because I had heard so many horror stories. And I was like, I'm going to be like under that spotlight there of like the person who for sure can't make the dumb comment and watch me do it because, you know, it could happen to anyone. At some point, I recognized that that was pretty selfish of me and that I would have to take some risk and be there for people when they were sitting Shiva, and I can't really avoid that piece. And so I just want to offer the first part and say that I think that people have to recognize, those who are setting Shiva need to recognize is that generally people are not doing this out of malice. They're doing this out of discomfort and out of their own challenges that they just don't know what to say. So I'm just asking you that if someone did say something inappropriate during Shiva and stuff like that, and like I said, you know, I've been in those shoes. I've also sat in Shiva, so I've experienced it on both ends. Just be compassionate about it and try to see if you can kind of have a conversation with the person if it's something that was really hurtful to you, or understanding the context of where that comes from. Glenn, I'm going to let you take in terms of the remarriage question because I know that you've had some experience with this. But I do want to say, and the one thing I do want to say is I have a series on this, and one of the things that I very much bring up there is the fact that don't bring a crisis into a crisis. I think in order to make many people feel better, people say, okay, let me solve this. And we know how to solve it in a way that makes us feel better. And sometimes by feeling, okay, I'm going to say something like, let me read you a shidduch. Then hopefully if that works out, boom, all the problems go away. The one thing I'm going to beg you is that just as we don't advise couples to bring a new baby into a tumultuous marriage, if somebody just experienced the loss of a spouse, let them have the space to figure this time out. Let them have the space to grieve. Let their children have the time and space to grieve. When they're kind of settled, if you will, into whatever space they are, at that point, they will indicate when they want to start exploring. But certainly I wouldn't be the one to push it on. Glenn, though, I think you had a lot more to say on this.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah Rivka. You know, it's hard. This whole experience of speaking is hard because being among the panelists here is, you know, it's hard to answer because, you know, the illustrious panel that we have. I just wanted to share a few thoughts. You know, in a lot of my work, I don't spend a lot of time talking about all the things that people say, and everybody has you know, a list of stories, one or questions or things that were said at Shiva that one's more shocking than the next. I think what I want to just echo back, one, it's Rivka Cohen said that the idea that people are well-meaning, sometimes we're self-serving, right? It's hard to confront death. Death is one of the most frightening and fragile things that people really just don't want to talk about. And part of that is because there is this great, and it's a beautiful midah that we want to fix things. We want to, maybe it's a thing that's into our neshama, that we want to grow and get better and make the world a better place. And sometimes those well-meaning efforts can result in another person getting hurt. I just wanted to share briefly, I have a great system for Shiva. And not everyone might subscribe to this, but what I do is when I go to Shiva house, to tell you what I do, I start with 100 points. And everything I say, I lose points. And if I say something really shocking, selfish, self-serving, and hurtful, then I lose a lot of points. It goes like 40 points, 50 points, 60 points. And if I say something really smart, so I lose only like 2 or 3 points. So I run, you know, I come out with a 98 or 97. I know for myself, the one thing that I remember most in Shiva was a person who came and he didn't say a word. He sat there, I didn't know him, he didn't know me, and he didn't say anything. But from the corner of my eye, I saw his face, and I knew right away that he experienced a loss of a child, just by looking at his face. And he sat there quiet, didn't say a word. And after however amount of time he was there, he walked over to me. He said, Hamakom. And he said, you know, I also have a son who's buried in Har Menuchos. And that, the impact of that statement that he said to me, besides the comfort it gave to me in the moment, but it's something that gives me, not only gives me comfort to this day, but it's something that's driven me, that's motivated me, this person probably doesn't even realize, in many, many interactions that I've had with other people, just to understand that it doesn't require a speech, it didn't require a fix. It just needed someone to kind of understand where I was. So I think that's an important point. We go to a Shiva house sometimes and we like, I remember there was someone who came to, it was a Shiva house and the person sat down and said, okay, 3 things. And like, it was in the manner of number 1. And if that doesn't fix you, number 2. And if that doesn't fix you, number 3. So I think we have to kind of get comfortable with our lack of control, our lack of ability to fix this. This isn't about fixing it. It's about human connection. Maybe it's about empathy. Maybe it's about a lot of things. The other thing I wanted to briefly touch upon, because I think it's something that has come up a number of times, is the question of asking someone when they're going to get remarried, asking someone who has lost a spouse. So I can emphatically say that Shiva would not be a recommended time to do that. I think there's a bigger question about when is an appropriate time. So the way I kind of perceive it, and I've spoken to a number of people who have lost a spouse, even recently, and they talked about this idea, people asking them when they get remarried and the pain that it causes them. And so does that mean you should never ask somebody when, if you have a shidduch and someone has been, after some reasonable period of time has lost their spouse, does that mean you should never try to help them? You should never respond? So the rule of thumb that I use for this is, one, if it's not for a practical purpose, then I would recommend not to ask them just because it's a good drama or a good gossip or it's something interesting to talk about. If you have somebody in mind, then I think it goes to perhaps if you were to ask any other very personal question, right? Think about the most personal question you could ask somebody, right? And do you need money? Something very personal. And kind of imagine how you might approach that, right? If you knew somebody needed money and you had the ability to give them money, right? Or you suspected someone needed money and you had that ability, should you just avoid it because it might hurt them? I think the rule of thumb, how you might deal with that is you might ask someone who's close to them. If you're very close, then you might mention something if you're close. And if you're not, you might find someone who's close to them and say, do you know if they're interested? I was thinking of them and had something in mind. So that's kind of the rule of thumb that I would use. But I think people don't realize how impacted a person can be by asking them questions that don't have a practical purpose. Now, there's a balance, right? We want to, she would never ask them if they have a place for Shabbos. She would never, try to approach them. So I think, there is a balance. What we want to kind of take into account that, one, is it practical? And 2, do I have this relationship with them where, they're going to feel comfortable? And that's kind of the way that the rules of thumb that I have. So thank you, David, for that question.
So Rivka, you said, don't bring a crisis into a crisis. Person is sitting Shiva. Don't bring a crisis into a crisis. And Glenn, I loved your 100 points. I think that that's advice for life, not only for a Shiva call. It's advice for life in every conversation that you're having with people. Rabbi Josh, would you like to add any thought about people offering shidduchim for people who were sitting Shiva or shortly thereafter?
Obviously, when someone's sitting Shiva, you shouldn't be offering shidduchim. I don't think anyone needs to hear that. I'm not sure how that happens. Again, I'm happy to answer other questions. To answer this question very briefly, the best route is to go through other people. If you want to find that if someone's dating, then ask their sibling or ask their friend or ask someone else, unless, as Glenn said, unless you're close with the person. and it's your good friend, then it's very, very easy to find other routes to find out if they're, if they're in the parsha, but nobody's in the parsha when they're sitting Shiva. So anytime in that range of, the first, month, 2, 3 is definitely inappropriate. And then, at a certain point, just ask people who are close to the person would be my very simple and short advice.
Yeah, don't be intrusive, and it really goes for so many other issues in life with children, with the loss, with fertility, with adoption. This is good advice in general. Ask the person that's closest to them that they would feel comfortable speaking to. Dr. Blumenthal, I'd like to ask you the flip side of this question concerning remarriage. A person remarries, a woman, a man at any age who lost a spouse remarries. It is fresh for the children who are single, and sometimes equally or more painful for the married ones to have a new person come into the house. Their father's new wife, their mother's new husband. And please, everyone, forgive me for any words. It's Erev Rosh Hashanah. Ayes Mechila in advance to anyone if I've said any words that come across in any way painful for anyone in the panel or anyone listening this evening. Dr. Blumenthal, it's painful for the kids who are single. It can be painful for the kids who are married, and they're seeing their parent with the new spouse in the house, the relationship, and everything that comes with it. What advice do you have for the newly married parents? And what advice do you have for the children at varying ages, please?
Oh, it's a lot. Do we have an extra hour for the presentation?
We have until Sunday night.
Okay. This really, in fact, I think we're planning a webinar dedicated to this very issue of marriage after loss. So it's really a topic unto itself. I will try to highlight maybe some of the most common misconceptions, perhaps errors that I see in this process. First of all, it never makes sense to marry out of desperation. And this very often is more applicable to whatever we're going to describe the widower or to the man who, I think, as Rabbi Greyjour described very beautifully, is suddenly saddled with a whole lot of responsibilities that he may not be used to. And sometimes out of, as I said, desperation, wants a woman in the house, may feel that the daughters need a mother, and or for that matter, also for, missing the physical intimacy of a marriage. And then anytime you do something out of desperation, you're going to make mistakes. Very often what I will tell young men and women who have just lost their spouses, that wait until your life is in order. Wait until you would see the new marriage as an enhancement of your life, but not a necessity. And then you'll be thinking straight, and then you'll be discerning. The research actually on second marriages, by the way, shows that very often, if they don't work, and most of them do, but if they don't work, very often the problem has more to do with the children than the couple. And I have even seen in my office couples come in and say, we're doing fine, but the kids are just, and we can't coordinate regarding the children. So the other, let's say, I'm going to say is a mistake, two other mistakes. First of all, one mistake I often hear is if someone, again, is now dating after the death of a spouse, and they say, before I make commitment, I want them to meet this person, the children to meet this person and see how well they get along. That's, first of all, children don't have that veto power. Second of all, it's not representative of how they're going to get along. But when you meet in an amusement park with a ton of gifts and feeding the children tons of cotton candy, that's not going to be representative of the life you're going to have together. So even though they're thrilled with this new person in that context, it's not going to necessarily be representative of what's like when you're married. What I recommend is you two decide. And once you've decided, before you make it a public announcement, that's when the children are introduced, but not because you're giving them veto power. And I would say the third most common thing, and all of these should be elaborated on more, so I'm sorry if I'm giving this sort of a short shrift. You're not one big happy family. you're two families and one family at the same time. And especially in the early stages of marriage, especially with children, I'm not talking about now toddlers and infants, but the new parental figure is an adult, someone who deserves respect, who has a semi-parental role, but has not replaced the parent who died. Nobody wants their parent replaced or supplanted. In fact, example, if whatever sort of a connotation was given to that parent, if that parent was mommy, the step parent is not going to be mommy. The step parent may be Ima, step parent, maybe mama, something different. But you make it clear, and the executive decisions still remain with the parent. So if the stepmother is home alone with the kids, it's bedtime, they're giving her a hard time, she's not going to penalize them, she's not going to do the usual parental enforcement. She'll say, you know, when daddy comes home, I'm going to tell him that you weren't cooperative. There's that you are in a semi-parental role, but you're not the full parent, because then you'll meet up with a lot of resistance. There's much more to talk about this. As I said, I really think it's a subject unto itself, but those are just some of the key points that I've observed over the years.
I appreciated that you said that one of the best things, that I think it was your second point, that one of the best things that parents who are remarrying can do is speak to their children, let them know what's going on, share it with them, make sure that they hear the announcement before the announcement, and that understanding that you're two families and a one family, and that has a lot of meaning in a two families and one family. Chaya Cohen, I'd tell me about an individual that's having difficulty grieving. Is that normal? Does a person have to grieve?
So I think that, you know, my other fellow panelists on the thing have said this very, very well. Grief is very, very unique. How they grieve, how you grieve is based off of you yourself. It's based off of your loss. It's based off of who you lost. I think it's such an interesting statement when people are like, well, I don't think they're really grieving, right? Like I saw my friend, she just lost her father. I don't think she's grieving. How do you really know somebody's grieving? We just have this idea. It's because they're crying. Like Sarah Rivka said, she was looking for pictures of a crying child, and that's how we perceive is somebody's grieving by that, you know, that they're crying, they look sad. The truth of the matter is that that person is still grieving. You know, that numbness that you feel in that initial time that you lost your loved one is really just an overload of so many different intense emotions that your body, and it's almost like a coping mechanism for your body, shuts down and says, you know what, hold on, I'm not ready to deal with all those intense emotions. It is a process of grief. They are grieving. And that is a normal process, because every step that you take towards, you know, working through the pain, because I'm not, you know, it's not getting over the pain, and moving forward, because you're not moving on, you're moving forward, is a grieving process. So I'm going to bring it back to you, David.
Good. Staying with the conversation, Glenn. Someone just lost someone that they love, a child, at any age. It's Rosh Hashanah, it's Yom Kippur. It's a time that people go through everything that they go through. And this person is asking a question. I cannot bear to go to shul. I cannot look at that empty chair. But it's Rosh Hashanah. How can I not go to shul? But I don't want to go to shul. I have difficulty with God. I have difficulty just getting there. Glenn, and then Rabbi Josh, please. Glenn?
Yeah, so I think, you know, we're constantly confronted with situations where our feelings are might be mixed, right? Where they might even conflict. So it's very common, Yom Tovim, I think specifically, especially the first ones, are extremely, or can be extremely difficult for people. Yom Tovim are often times for families to get together, right? It's family time. And to go through Yom Tif without your family or without some member of your family is extremely difficult. And it's a time, the times of joy, once were the most loving, special family times, can be the other way. The other piece that you mentioned was specifically about davening. And, perhaps not being able to feel comfortable, like I don't know what to say, or I'm angry at God, or I don't have the words, or it's too difficult for me. I think one of the most fundamental things that I feel when I work with people is that we have to give ourselves permission, not only to have our feelings, but also to make space for more than one feeling. It can be both. I could want to go to shul. I could feel like this is the right thing to do. And it could also feel like this might be too much for me. I could feel like I want to daven to Hashem. This is what I've always done. I want to be connected to Hashem. And at the same time, I can feel like I'm really angry and I feel betrayed. So I think that it's very, not only to say that it's normal to have these either different or conflicting feelings, but at the same time, I think we have to be able to look to ourselves and be able to accept that we might have feelings that we're not comfortable, right? Someone who was always, who always davened and was very close to, and felt very close to Hashem and felt very comfortable davening. It had a lot of meaning for them. That after a loss, it might just be something very different. It might be feelings that they've never felt before, or that they are totally uncomfortable with. So I think that the if I have to be general, then that idea that just to be self-compassion, right? This year, I can't do what I did last year. This year, I'm not at the same place where I was. And this year, I'm going to have, not only have self-compassion, but maybe we can even imagine that Hashem would have compassion on us. Hashem would be understanding of the situation we're going through. And that's kind of the way that I approach these things. Thank you, David.
What about Josh?
I think there's two different things and two different parts to the question. I think one part of the question is going to shul, and one is davening in general. Personally, I very much understand, and I would even say relate to someone who says they don't want to be in shul. Specifically Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. In general, not wanting to be in shul. I would say if it's a woman who is, I believe, the one. Again, if a woman asking the question, there's definitely no obligation to be in shul. Again, I think that sometimes it's the setting itself that's extremely uncomfortable, whether that's uncomfortable because of the people that are asking, again, questions, giving eyes, looking at you. I think for a person, I'm not a Rav Paskening, so I'm just saying my own feeling though. I think that a person saying I'm not going to go this year on Rosh Hashanah is very different than saying I'm never going to go to shul again on Rosh Hashanah. I would imagine that most Rabbanim in most communities would say that that's totally fine to say this is a year to go to shul on Rosh Hashanah. Again, I think that is both normal, appropriate, and I would say probably pretty common. Or at least taking breaks or going for less time is extremely reasonable and understandable. In terms of the question of like davening in general, again, I tend to take a more approach of like understanding where it's coming from. My feeling is that people's emunah in Hashem actually doesn't change much when they go through a difficult time. It just gets revealed more. It's more like it's shedding light on the emunah that they had beforehand. People who had very strong emunah before they went through a hard time, I find cling to that emunah. And people who didn't have very strong emunah before they went through a hard time are kind of clinging to all the questions that they had before they went through that hard time. If I could say anything, I would say people should be working on their emunah well before they're going through a difficult time, because difficult time is only going to reveal what they were feeling more than it's going to create those feelings. That being said, I think that a person who is in the heat of a moment dealing with a very hard time I definitely can say for myself, and I talk about this pretty publicly, more before my wife died than after my wife died. That my wife was very sick for a significant period of time. When you're davening for the same thing over and over again, and she's not getting better, and you're not seeing anything positive, it definitely makes it very hard to keep davening for that. I very much found it very hard to keep davening for the same thing over and over again when you see the person deteriorating, and you're wondering, like, that feeling for me was very real. It wasn't like, it was a very, very real feeling. I don't, it was a moment in time. Moment in time can be a month, 2 months, a year, when tefillah was very, very hard. I personally didn't give up on tefillah. I didn't stop davening, but it definitely meant a lot less to me, I would say, for a significant period of time. I believe we say in Megillah Eicha that, like, Hashem sasam tefillasi, that Hashem, like, silenced my tefillas. That idea that our tefillas are silenced and our tefillas are kind of pushed aside, and we feel that. Again, that as long as that's temporary, it's very different than someone saying, I will never daven again in my life. Usually when they say that, they probably don't mean it. They probably mean they're not going to daven for the next month, 2 or 3. But again, I think that, like, allowing people space is both halachically permissible and emotionally understandable to say, like, now, again, I don't want to say I'm not going to daven, but I'm going to daven less, or I'm going to daven differently, or my davening is not going to be as meaningful. To me, that's very normal. I think we find a lot of those examples throughout Tanakh. If you open up Tehillim, David HaMelech said, like, Keli lama azavtani, he complained to Hashem, why did you abandon me? There's a lot of examples in Tanakh of great people saying Hashem's ignoring my tefillos, and it's very frustrating. I think it's a very normal feeling. That's what I would say.
Thank you for sharing your very personal reflections during the time that your wife was sick and she passed away. So, Rivka Cohn, your thoughts on this conversation, going to shul when you don't feel you have the energy or the connection?
So a couple of things I want to say. Number one is that tefillah is always called Abayta Shebelev, and it is a work of the heart. And when the heart is hurting a lot and the heart is feeling a lot of the feelings, it's really hard to access. And I think that's the correlation between people who are in a lot of pain finding a hard time with davening, more so than with kashrus, more so with anything else, because tefillah is an emotional experience. And when you're not ready to touch emotions, good ones, bad ones, or anything in between, it's really, really difficult to do something like davening. So just knowing that as just a framework. There were 2 things that I did want to share about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Well, not so much for Rosh Hashanah, but certainly for Yom Kippur, and a lot is true for Shmini Atzeres as well, and for Pesach and Shavuos. For those of us who say Yisker, that may be the reason, particularly for teenagers, of avoidance sometimes of shul. And there is a mistaken belief out there is that Yisker needs to be said with a minyan, and I take every opportunity to educate people, is that Yisker is a tefillah that can be said at home. It is not Kaddish. It is not required with a minyan. I know many, many people who personally feel the anxiety of being in a shul and being in that environment where people are walking out there, staying in and stuff like that. And if that's what it is for you, so then say the tefillah at home. Certainly, it's not something that should be this anxiety producing. For some people, it is the most wonderful experience. I've had kids say it was their best moment where they finally were able to prove to the world that they were different than everybody else in shul. So I've certainly seen it go round and round, but certainly it's something to be aware of. One quick story, in the Kovna ghetto, there was a roundup of women and children one day. And they came running to the Kovna Rav, and they said, Kovna Rav, the men who are left in this ghetto are not believers. They are all throwing their tefillin out the window. The Kovna Rav said, I've got to see this with my own eyes. These are the greatest ma'aminim, the greatest believers that there are. Because you can only be angry at a being that you believe in. Because if that being is worth nothing, you are not angry at it, because you're not angry at an inanimate wall that cannot move. And so I want to speak to those of people here who are feeling those feelings of anger, who are feeling those feelings of distance, of just frustration and stuff like that. This is because you are actually in the greatest state of belief. You're in a state of belief where you know that there's nobody other than Hashem that caused this to happen. And therefore, I'm really angry at him. But look at that core belief of yours. That's really incredible. And I think sometimes people are so hard on themselves, and just realize that that's really where you're at, which is quite a level to be at. And like you said, find someone who can be compassionate towards you and figure out the journey that it needs to be to reconnect and reinvent the relationship. But really just know that it's coming from a place that actually is a really deep, deep, deep belief, and talk out those negative feelings the same way we talk about it in a marriage. Saying that I'm not going to talk about negative feelings is a surefire way to fail. Talk to Hashem about your negative feelings. I'm really angry at you is a form of tefillah. And it's a beautiful form of tefillah that has its ability to reconnect the same way when we're angry at someone, and talking it through is a way to reconnect to the person. Avoidance and apathy is a surefire way that it's really difficult to connect through that.
So Rivka, thanks for sharing that story about the tefillin and the Kovna Rebbe. It's a well-known story, and it's a very strong story, as you say, about Maminim. Rabbi Josh Grashauer mentioned the word Amunah. I'd like to relate to you a story that I witnessed that's very pertinent to this conversation. It was a few short years ago. There was a young man that was struggling in life. He had a lot of questions about a lot of different things, including about religion. He and I happened to be speaking a number of times, and he just questioned everything. He questioned everything. And I may have told the story last time. I don't remember if I did. Everyone raise your hand and stop me. And I asked him if he could ask any question that he has to anyone, any major therapist, any gadol, anyone. And he said to me, testing me, sure, if I could have a meeting with Rav David Feinstein, very casual, offhanded, sure. Okay, pick a meeting with the gadol ador. Thankfully, he mentioned somebody, in the US in New York. I said, so if I'm able to arrange a meeting for you with Rav David Feinstein, would you go and have a conversation with him? Anticipating that it was never going to happen, he had nothing to lose, he had sure. I happen to have a relationship with someone who's very close with Rav David. So a little later, I said to him, we have a meeting with Rav David Feinstein tomorrow at a certain time. Okay, to make the story very quick, he and I went to Rav David Feinstein, and I introduced him to Rav David. And I said to the young man, I will step out right now so you and Rav David can have any conversation that you want. He was very much intimidated, and he said, please stay, David. So I stayed. And Rav David Zatzal, everyone knows Rav David Zatzal, very easy, very open, easy to speak to, why are we here? He had a conversation with him for a couple of minutes, and then, why are we here? He said, I'm having trouble in my bitochen. I'm having trouble with God. I just don't believe because of the circumstances that I had, the things that happened in my life. So Rav David have a conversation with him for a couple of minutes. And then, so Rivka, you mentioned the tefillin. After a back and forth of a couple times, the young man said to him, I have no interest in putting on tefillin. Rav David said, okay. It's like, okay. Spoke a couple of minutes, and Rav David said to him, why don't you just put it on, say Kriya Shema, and take it off. Mamish 1 minute. Put it on, say Kriya Shema, and take it off. And the young man said to Rav David Feinstein, because I have no emunah, why should I put on tefillin? And I'm sitting there and I can relate it to you personally. Rav David Feinstein said to the young man, I give you permission to put on tefillin and say Kriya Shema with zero emunah. Say Kriya Shema with no emunah. Everyone has their own space, their own time, whatever they're thinking, difficult to go to shul. None of us here can experience. I cannot experience, hopefully, what you folks have experienced. Everyone has their own story. No one goes through life unscathed. People that are saying right now they can't go to shul, maybe go to shul and listen to shofar from outside the window. Don't go into shul. Have somebody come to your house and blow shofar. Don't go into shul. Rav David Feinstein said to this young man, put on tefillin. I am giving you rishus to say Kriya Shema with no emunah. A lot of people would like the rishus from the Gadol Hador to daven without any emunah. Dr. Blumenthal, we covered a lot this evening about loss, about grieving, about the difference between not speaking versus depression, about normal versus abnormal, about remarriage. You've literally traveled the world in your conversation with people in this conversation about grief, bereavement, and trauma. What have you found are the most common elements, the one or two common elements that get people through a most difficult moment, whatever that moment might be?
I guess I would have to say is to embrace your humanity, to allow yourself to be vulnerable. That, when it's grief, it's the pain that leads to the consolation. When it's trauma, it's the horror and fright that leads to calmness. We don't have to be superhuman. We can be weak, we can be vulnerable, and it takes a very strong person to allow themselves to be weak and vulnerable. I'd have to say that's the overarching message.
Embrace humanity. Don't be superhuman. Allow yourself to speak to other people. Allow other people into your life. Share your pain with someone whom you trust. Share your grief with someone who you have confidence will not repeat words that you don't want repeated. I heard Dr. Blumenthal mention at a weekend of about 30 couples who each lost a child, he talked with them about always mention the name. Always mention the name. That's the way of keeping a person alive. Glenn, I have an impossible question to ask you. You lost two daughters several years apart. Was there a moment that you felt that you got back to yourself? You never forget the loss of a child, Rahman al-Islam. Was there a moment that you felt, I can deal with my life? What was that moment, Glenn?
Yeah. So I think it's, the way I feel about it is like this. I don't think it's, the idea is, I don't think there's any getting back to what was. I think for a lot of people, myself, I don't know if the idea is that, to be the same. I think we can be different, and being different might be better, it might be worse. But for most people, it'll be different. I think that what I like to think about is, people say, does time heal? Does, what happens after, a period of time? Do you just kind of move on? Is it kind of in your rear view mirror, right? How do you manage to live a normal life? So this is a very big topic overall. So I'm just going to address specifically one particular point here. The way I like to think of it is that, especially when it's, kind of a loss like a child, like a sibling, could be like a spouse, could be a parent. With some of these type of losses, the deep losses. So it's not about time, helping you to forget. I don't know if it's about time on its own, just healing. I like to believe that what happens is that we get stronger. Not that the package gets lessened. Not that the backpack that we carry is forgotten. I think it's that we become more capable of carrying that backpack, whether it be because of its weight, its shape or size, that we become stronger. Sometimes I describe that when I remember, when the loss is fresh, I liken it to looking into a light bulb. If you ever look at a light, sun, so you have these spots, right? You'll see these kind of spots in your eyes, and everywhere you look, you see those spots. And when you close your eyes, they're still there. And when it's fresh, this is the way I like to describe it. And over time, it's not necessarily in the front, like those spots that you see everywhere. Maybe it moves to the corner. I like to say that over time, we learn how to make space for other things. We learn how to make space for joy, for satisfaction, for comfort, for love, for all these other emotions. When the loss is fresh, sometimes it's like that's all there is. We can't see anything else. There's no space for anything else. There's no room for anything else in our lives. And as we get stronger, we learn how to make space for other things. And everyone's journey is going to be different. Everybody's needs are going to be different. Every person is going to have a different set of feelings, a different way to cope. And if they can accept that this is a process, if they can accept that even though there are people in life who want us to move on, there are people in either our immediate world or maybe even in the further than that they want us to move on. They want us to just get back to normal, right? Why can't you get over this and just get back to the normal place that you were? And this is something I've experienced. It's something I experienced in the many people that I've had to, have the unfortunate or fortunate circumstances to meet in my work. It's not getting back to normal. It's just finding a new way forward. It's moving through. It's not putting it behind us. It's just putting us forward in a way that we can carry what we've been through. And there's a variety of different ways that's happened. For me, certainly I carry my kids with me in all the work that I do. Everything that I do, everywhere I am, I feel like my girls are with me. My girls helping other people who were suffering was part of their lives. Right? Miriam was Miriam. It was named after my daughter Miriam because this was what she did while she was alive. So this keeps me with them. It doesn't put them in the rearview mirror. It doesn't make them not a part of me. It's just finding a way forward where I'm carrying them with me wherever I go. Thank you.
Glenn, you said making space for other emotions. And I wrote down a couple of words while you were speaking. You celebrate life. You don't mourn the loss. You remember the loss. You never forget. You don't spend your days mourning the loss. You spend your days celebrating life. All the things that Miriam did, all the things that your daughter did. This is a conversation that I feel personally so small, listening to all of you speak in such profound ways, sharing your really personal stories. There are many people who have experienced tremendous difficulties in life, and they're private people. They can't share it. And everyone on this call is sharing your innermost personal thoughts so other people can learn from it. I'm really very honored this evening to have spent these 90 minutes speaking with you and having a conversation with you. I have no doubt that one person, only one person, needed to benefit from this evening. Only one. Only one person needs to leave tonight's conversation and in some way be consoled, have nechama. Only one person needs to go into Rosh Hashanah and remember this conversation tonight and feel that they took something in with them. And you folks will have changed the world of one individual. So Rivka Cohn and Chaya Cohn and Glenn Holman and Rabbi Josh Grashauer and Dr. Norman Blumenthal, and to my colleagues Sivi Rido and Cheryl Chernovsky, who organized this evening, and to Laura Bart, who helped to organize this evening, and to all my colleagues at OHEL and everyone else, we thank you. We wish everyone a Shana Tova Metuka, a Ksiva V'Chasima Tova. You should not only have a happy and healthy year, you should never, ever, ever know any pain and sorrow at all, and certainly none that you've already experienced. Our sincere thanks to you and to everyone joining this evening. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night.